Okay, so as folks are still trickling in, let's get started. So bonjour everyone and welcome. I'm Jen Milguy, Director of IP and Partnerships, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Expanding Horizons, Pathways to Canadian Tech to Scale in Europe. As myself and much of the digital team are based in Vancouver, we respectfully acknowledge that we work, learn, and live on the traditional ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with attendees. If at any point during the session you have a question, please type it into the chat and we'll address them during the Q&A portion at the end. It's wonderful to have attendees from across the country and across continents. As we've some new faces with us before we dive into today's session, I'll start with a quick overview of digital. As Canada's global innovation cluster for digital technologies, our model brings together technology builders and buyers to commercialize breakthrough solutions and tackle Canada's biggest challenges, from defense and housing to critical minerals and health, better than any single organization could do alone. With over 1,500 members across the country and globally, we act as a catalyst that transforms innovation into deployable, market-ready products across key sectors. Next slide, please. To date, we've over $300 million in public sector investment that has been leveraged with private sector co-investment to over $780 million, resulting in nearly 200 commercial products launched globally, 700 plus IP assets built and retained in Canada, over 34,000 jobs created, and over 760 million new funds raised by Canadian SMEs, some of which of you are joining us on this call today. Whether you're considering your first move into Europe or seeking to raise capital abroad, the EU offers a dynamic and diverse market, and Europe's healthcare sector in particular is undergoing rapid digital transformation and regulatory modernization, and strong investment appetite is creating unique opportunities for Canadian tech innovators with ready-to-commercialize solutions to scale and position themselves for successful European expansion. During our 60 minutes together, the aim is for you to gain insights into the EU outlook landscape, key trends and opportunities in the European market landscape, understanding European investment, and how European capital fits into your growth strategy, and practical guidance for pathways for entry. Next slide, please. I have the pleasure of introducing today's guests. Please join me in welcoming Chris Duty, Konstantinos Kapsoropoulos, I will call you Kostas from this point forward, Richard Seeley, Philip Staff, and Robert Pancho. Chris is Director of Investment Oversight at Digital, having spent over a decade in financial environments across public and private sectors in Canada and Europe. His work spans investment monitoring, risk management, and knowledge mobilization, and he leads Digital's mining and energy portfolio. Kostas is the Digital and Science Counselor at the EU delegation to Canada. His areas of expertise include geopolitics and technology, digital and science diplomacy, and digital identities. Prior to coming to Ottawa, he served as International Relations Officer at the Commission's DG Connect and oversaw the EU's digital partnerships with Japan and South Korea. Richard is partner at WeCan and an international banking and management consultant executive with 25 plus years experience. Based in the UK, Switzerland, and France, he's a specialist in M&A, strategic sourcing, and operational restructuring across highly regulated industries. Philip, partner at WeCan, and a global branding and communications lead with 30 plus years experience founding, growing, and exiting marketing and digital agencies in the UK and Europe. He works with some of the world's biggest brands, advised on startups, market entry, and M&A across many sectors. And last but not least, Robert, partner at WeCan, CPA and CFA charter holder with over 25 years of experience in asset management and banking across Europe, facilitating access to private equity, venture capital, family office, and bank and financing. My friends, today you are in for a powerhouse panel and discussion. And with that, Kostas, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jen, and I will be happy to contribute to this powerhouse webinar. You have said a lot of things in your introduction about the investment, first of all, environment in Europe. Indeed, the first message that I want to pass here is that Europe has all the assets needed to attract investment, the savings, the skills, and the innovation. What we are doing now in the European Union level is to mobilize collectively all these assets to their full potential. And we are doing it also looking outwards, of course. We are looking to strategic partners like Canada. we work together. And I will tell you how we work together with two concrete examples. So in my introduction, I will start with examples already. We need to be practical. The European Union and Canada have a digital partnership. The digital partnership is a very strong enhanced collaboration in all areas that pertain to digital, from research and innovation to regulatory cooperation and standards, and also to infrastructure. What happened in December is that we had a very high-level ministerial meeting chaired by Minister Salomon and the Executive Vice President Virkkunen from the European Commission, who chaired the first EU Digital Partnership Council Ministerial in Montreal in the margins of the G7. It was a very important meeting because it opened a lot of ambitious avenues which are of interest to you in technology field. First of all, there were a lot of deliverables enabling innovation and research. And I think what is particularly uh, relevant for you is that the first deliverable is to collaborate on accelerating sectoral AI adoption, for example, in healthcare. They mention, of course, other issues like other fields like manufacturing, energy, culture, science, and public services, but I would stay here in the healthcare domain, which is the most relevant for this webinar. So we have started implementing this. We will share best practices and we'll do joint workshops, and we need you, all stakeholders, to be part of these workshops. So that's the first thing, concrete example, what the public authorities are, between the European Union and Canada are doing to scale up the digital cooperation between two strategic partners. Now I will come to a second example, also practical, that everybody knows in Canada, I think even more than the digital partnership, which is something new. And I'm going to talk about Horizon Europe. Horizon Europe is the largest multilateral funding instrument for research and innovation. It spans from 2021 to 2027. Since July 2024, Canada is associated to Horizon Europe, which means that Canadian researchers and companies can participate to competitive research calls for funding on the same terms like member states of the European Union, exactly like Austria, like Germany or France. So Canada has exactly the same terms to participate to competitive calls to have funding for research. Pillar 2 is about global challenges, and one of the global challenges is, of course, health. So there is a health cluster where there are calls that researchers, universities, but also companies can create consortia with European companies and other interested stakeholders and bid for these calls. That's very important. We really have been working with ISET, the Investment Science and Economic Development Canada, around Canada to promote the opportunities for Canadians after the association. I would like to tell you that in March, we are preparing a roadshow covering many areas of Canada. Jen has been in one in the past, in the previous last year, where we met actually. This year, we will cover Manitoba, Quebec, and Ontario. We will go specifically to ecosystems, technology ecosystems, to inform them about how concretely stakeholders can participate to competitive calls under Horizon Europe. So these are two examples in my introduction about how Europe and Canada concretely work together to bring solutions and opportunities for businesses in the tech field of both sides. Now, I would like to say two future initiatives that we are undertaking in the EU, which could be also relevant for you for information purposes. As I said in the beginning, Europe has all the assets it needs to attract investment. But we are an internal market of 27 member states, and that means that sometimes there are fragmentations that we need to overcome. So in order to create a single and simple set of rules to help startups scale around and across the European Union, I repeat, it's about the internal European Union between the member states. We will soon put forward the 28th regime, as we call it. This will create, and we call it 28 because there are 27 member states. So the 28th regime will be a common set of rules which will be relevant and can be applicable across the 27 member states. The ultimate aim is to create a new structure. Uh, we need a single and simple set of rules that will apply seamlessly all over our union so that businesses can operate across member states much more easily. After the 28th regime, as we call it, our entrepreneurs will be able to register a company, for example, in any member state within 48 hours, and that fully online. Entrepreneurs will enjoy the same capital regime all across the EU. And ultimately, we will create a system where companies can do business and raise financing seamlessly across Europe, just as easily as in uniform markets like the US or China. I'm sure that if we get this right and if we move enough, this will not only help EU companies grow, but it will attract investment from across the world. That is the first initiative that I wanted to inform you. Now we'll go to the second initiative that we are working on in the European Union. This is about investment and capital. We are currently building across the European Union the Savings and Investment Union. We need a large-scale, deep and liquid capital market that attracts a wide range of investors. This will allow businesses to find the funding they need, including equity, at lower cost in Europe. We have made already legislative proposals to create that on market integration and supervision to ensure our financial market is more integrated. This will cover trading, post-trading, and asset management, as well as driving innovation and making our supervisory framework more efficient. This will help ensure that capital flows where it is needed from scale-ups to SMEs, and innovation comes through industry. So we have a lot of work in the European Union in Brussels to do that, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of the latest which is happening in Brussels. So that's from my introduction, Jen, and happy again to participate to digital initiatives.
Thank you so much, Costas. And with that, Chris, we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Costas, for that excellent framing and really just showing why Europe matters and the broader landscape that is there available. So what I'd like to do now is shift from the why really to the how the companies can execute that. And I just want to say before that the audience, there will be a Q&A opportunity at the end. So please put your questions in the chat, and what we can do is we can get to those at the end. So for Canadian digital and health tech companies, scaling into Europe isn't just about finding customers. It's about navigating capital, structure, readiness, and timing in a market that often looks familiar on the surface, but operates very differently in practice. So WeCan sits at the intersection of market access and capital access. So today I'd like to unpack what actually works, what tends to trip companies up, and how founders can be better prepared before they take that step into Europe. So thank you, Richard, and Robert, for talking to me today. What I'd like to do is start with just the question, how should Canadian digital or health tech companies think about Europe as a market for expansion?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I presume everyone can hear me okay. So oh, this legend. Look, thanks, Chris and Jen, for having us, and obviously thanks everyone for taking time out to join us for an hour. A lot to unpack in a short time, so we'll do our best. And also, just to contextualize it a bit, too, WeCan is founded by Canadians, and we exist for the purpose of taking Canadians at a growth stage at the juncture where scaling internationally becomes. We've lost the screen. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, no, carry on. Oh, fantastic. That's good. So look, we just to recap, we exist at the juncture where Canadian companies are looking to internationalize. So our focus is very much at the growth stage, and a lot of how we see things. I guess a lot of what we'll be speaking about today is really contextualized around that growth stage of a business. So just to say that. But coming back to your question, Chris. Yeah, I think your question was, do Canadians look at one monolithic market? How do they look at it differently? And we would like to approach it from a slightly different view, which is we would encourage Canadian business to look at themselves as a business archetype first, and then ask the question, why is Europe critically important to my business? Because once you understand the purpose and have conviction of why you need to be in Europe, the question of the pathway to Europe becomes clearer. And then the decision about the choices of how to execute, which comes down to which markets do I enter and in which way do I enter those markets. All those complex decision factors become much easier if upfront you take a look at yourself as a business. And we use the term an archetype, and we can dive into that a little bit. So that's the conceptual approach. And we put this graphic up here if everyone can see it, because we want to just sort of visualize what we mean by that. And we applied that to a lens on Canada. So let me just talk through what's on the screen. Um, what does Canada look like if you're sitting in Europe? So this is what it looks like from our perspective. We have 1.3 million Canadian businesses registered, of which nearly a million are actually actively trading. So it's a huge market. The SME market is about 135,000. So again, a huge market of trading active companies in Canada. There's about 40,000 of those companies are arguably prepared to trade outside of Canada. And even a smaller portion, we believe about 20,000 for the sake of magnitude, about 20,000 would be demonstrably capable of sustaining themselves in Europe. So we go from a very, very large business community down to what sounds like a relatively small few companies that would really succeed well in Canada. And then we've shown on the top this 2,000 to 3,000 high potential. And I think we need to just describe that quickly because it really feeds into a lot of what we're talking about in terms of pathways and capital choices. So what do we mean? Why is there 2,000 to 3,000 high potential? And the good news before I go is I think a lot of people on this call are in that top because a large determination of being strategically high potential in the eyes of Europe is if you're in one of the key strategic sectors like health. But digital health, protein engineering, sustainability technologies, advanced manufacturing, advanced engineering, these are very strategically important to Canada. The good news is they're strategically important to Europe, and that sort of accelerates companies into a much more desirable cohort. What amplifies that even further is those companies that have gone through a process like a cluster program, which gives a evidence-based financial health view of the company. It further amplifies that these are strong balance sheet, strong companies, proven IP, they own their IP. And actually, if you begin to check the qualification boxes, this really casts them into a very attractive light. And it's that pinnacle that really drives the deal flow we see into Europe. So we felt that was important just to contextualize the market that we see and the market that we see coming into Europe for capital, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, thanks. So as you see, you've got that. There's quite a large proportion. You've got that 20K growth stage sustained international export capable. So and then you've got that high potential. So I think I want to touch on that there's obviously an opportunity there. And so when companies are actually struggling to scale into Europe, is the gap that you're seeing from these that's taking them from that growth stage to that 2 to 3K high potential? Is that gap usually like financial, organizational, or strategic? What can take that for the 60K that you have there and the two lowers up into that very high potential?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, the truth is they all work together. So I'd say the strategic choice, and I want to get into it's a really good point. Strategic choice and conviction and purpose really has a huge impact on success, risk, timelines. And so I think if we can work through that in the rest of the presentation, that's a key thing that we hope we can communicate today. Just to illustrate the point a little bit too, I mean, a lot of Canadian companies we see approach Europe as almost like a tourist approach. They kind of go geography market led first. And we see about a 93% failure rate to actually get to introduction stage. So we feel quite strongly about this because there's a much better way, and we recognize clearly that traveling to Europe, going to shows, and having failed attempts to get introduction becomes very distracting for management. It's time consuming, it's expensive. So I think if we could jump to the next slide, I want to try to build on that point a bit.
I think that 93% failure is definitely a key point to address, because the 7% is what we're aiming to get you guys into, and actually really to try and grow that 7% to ideally get it to double figures.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually raise a good point too, because I think it begs the question, what is the volume of successful if they're high value, strategically well-positioned companies, what's the flow? And just to kind of get a sense around that flow, there is about 14 to about between 10 and 15% of Canadian growth stage companies achieve their capital in Europe. So that's a dimension that will grow. We'll talk about why, because Europe is going to become more, we believe Europe will become more interested in Canada. And secondly, the pipeline of available deals will grow as well, because there's a growing pool of interested capital that is more prepared to move into Canadian digital. So we think the good news story for Canada particularly, and quite quickly, is that pipeline is going to get bigger. There'll be more deal flow, and the flow of that deal into Europe will become bigger as well. That's our hypothesis. We have this graphic here, and this graphic is intended to give a sense of what we mean by that flowing into Europe. And I think, Chris, your original point was, how should we look at Europe, and do we look at it as one monolithic market? It's a big market, it's an attractive market, but we look at it differently, because if you start, and we've isolated health, because I think the biggest community on the call today is sort of health tech. So we've broken down the subset of health tech subsectors, and we've used nomenclature that's common in Europe. So I think some people could say we could slice it this way or that way, but the message will still be the same, that you occupy a certain business archetype because of the nature of your product and service, which informs the right pathway to the kind of capital. So in the middle of our graphic, we talk about a capital thesis or a mandate, which really means nothing more than the nature of what you produce, the risk, the time to market, the regulatory barriers, these dimensions of your business inform your route of capital. So you make a bit of a mandate decision first, whether it's patient capital, it's VC, it's public-private blended, and it drives the purpose, and then purpose becomes very important, because now you understand why are we raising capital, and what's the nature of that capital I need, and that's a good first step, because if you look to the right of the diagram, the choices amplify again, because now you look at the different types of capital sources that you may want to approach, which is entirely informed by the nature of the capital you want. And we can dive into that a little bit. I'm just going to maybe just take a second to talk about the boxes on the right. We'll get into this in some detail, but there's just to amplify the diversity of the capital choice. You know about growth VC, you know about sovereign-backed, and you know about family offices, and these various flavors of debt and equity are moving independently in terms of size and investment appetite and risk appetite. So we'll talk a bit about that. I singled out two brighter red ones, corporate, because I don't hear this come up very much, and I think it's quite important. So I just want to make sure it goes into the mix. If you haven't heard of corporate VC, corporate venture capital, or corporate venture client, this is a growing and increasingly sophisticated pool of capital in Europe, and it's particularly appropriate for a lot of the top pinnacle companies that we talked about, because it opens up a broader choice of partnership in capital and funding that is more closely linked to supply and licensing and other easier to transact relationships. So it's a very important path to Europe, which I don't hear being discussed very often. From our perspective, it sits amongst that whole landscape of choice. So we'd like to just sort of get that out there.
Which there's probably around about 14 categories of capital. We've got 7 boxes there, but 14 is roughly the number we work with.
I want to, Chris, if you don't mind, I'm going to look at the next slide because I promise this is the last slide for us because I think it's much more interesting for us to just talk. But I think we felt it was good to kind of get a couple conceptual ideas out there with the audience, and then we can talk about them together. So the only message here on this slide is, we're going to talk a bit about available capital and access to capital, and they're really important distinctions. If you look at the slide, we see 3,850 firms across the landscape we concern ourselves with. So we look at Europe, continental Europe, which includes the UK, obviously, the EEA, and we look at the UK I mentioned, and we also look at UAE because it's another important pool of capital that's increasingly interesting for us. So our lens is that physical footprint. The other lens we take, of course, is growth. So even within those parameters, we kind of watch 3,850 firms. So it's a huge choice of parties to work with. That pool represents about 2 trillion euros. And it's about, as of today, just between 40 and 50% of dry powder, which means there's a lot of capital pool undeployed, looking for deployment, looking increasingly to Canada. So the market is like, I think the net message there is that capital is available, it's growing, and we can talk a bit more about how much it's growing and how, but it will not change the underlying fact, which is there's capital in Europe waiting for Canadians. And I think today's discussion is, well, then how do we execute that access?
Yeah.
And I think that's it for our slides, unless there's any questions on the graphics.
No, so I was actually going to, and it brings me to my question. You touched on it then. From when you look at that, there's a lot of categories of capital that's sort of available, but like in practice, what does that actually mean? And I think that what I'd like to touch on is that from that looking at that, you actually say, okay, the availability of capital, there's lots, but what actually is accessible for organizations, and how can our the founders in the room make that distinction of actually what is accessible to them, and then what tactical capital planning can they do maybe for them prior to engaging in European investors to actually understand which of those avenues are available to them or accessible to them.
Yeah, great question. I'll probably start, and I'm going to invite my colleagues because Robert is involved quite a lot with the structuring. So I think you can add a lot of color to what do they actually look like when you get there. But let me kind of cue it up a bit. And actually, I think Phil will be able to talk a little bit about health sector and specifics because it's actually important nuance, because I think in the health tech space there are certain nuances that are specific to that domain. Thematically the same as anyone going to Europe in growth stage, but I think it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about health. Yeah, sure. But before we do, let me just try to cue up. So, I guess we are really we emphasize a lot, know before you go. And it comes back to the fact that going before you're prepared, I think you can't afford the failure rate at a growth stage. It's too expensive, it's too distracting. So what does know before you go mean? The purpose of your capital raise and the purpose of your market entry needs to be thought through, because one of the distinctions of Europe that is slightly different to North America, I would say, at a very general level, there's going to be more emphasis on due diligence, right? There's going to be more emphasis on evidence of due diligence, and there's a strong desire to see demonstrable conviction around Europe. And by that I mean companies that come to Europe and they're exploring the market, and maybe want to raise runway money because they want to test the market. That's a recipe, I think, not for failure, but I think it's not a strong purpose.
It's probably a large proportion of the 93% that are that have tried that method.
Absolutely. So preparation steps is to go through the process of understanding why is Europe strategically important to your product, to your market strategy. It may be because it's a supply chain strategic decision. You need to be plugged into that ecosystem. That's where the clients are. That's where your best route to market is. It may be that it's the right kind of capital fit. There'll be many reasons why you could defend the purpose of going to Europe, and spending time on that up front allows you to then navigate that multi-pathway we discussed, which is who do I need to speak to about what. So I think if I answer your question correctly, Chris, it's that upfront assessment of yourself as a business and what Europe means and investigating that before you make the physical leap to Europe.
And if I can add, the fact that in Europe they have the sense of regarding in comparison with North America, regarding risk management, it's very important. And if they see your business plan not so robust or prepared or organized, it could take a longer path and maybe a failure because they want to be reassured. They are not I would say cowboy like some South North American could be, and it's where it's the difference. But if you are well prepared and you organize and you structure your 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 reason why and know before you go, for example, I think it could be the key differentiator regarding a success or not.
Do you want to, I mean, are you okay to touch upon some of the clients like our restaurant clients?
Yeah.
So I asked Robert just to give her an anecdote, a real story, because I think it makes it less texture about what does it mean when you come and you once you've arrived, you then start to refine your purpose.
Yeah, it's we have one client, pretty well-known brand, that try now to conquer one country in Europe. But they had already a discussion in the past, but they were not converting their plan because regarding preparation, the famous know before you go, more detail in their approach. They are just pushed back. Now we try to work together in a way to be more focused and find the proper investor for their case and improving their business case at the same time.
Mhm.
I just have another. I'm trying to lend this few pragmatic or empirical cases. Like, so one is if, and I think in health tech, and you can keep me better refined here. If you're pursuing a path that requires in-country certification processes to be able to exploit the markets, where that links into capital, some capital sources are designed to support you through that certification clinical trial, that kind of process. It's built for that purpose, whereas another adjacent capital source is not at all built for that purpose. So going back to sort of know before you go, if you think about that in terms before I go, is wherever you are in that stage of market entry, particularly in sort of these heavily regulated areas, there is capital available, but defining what you need, why, the purpose to approach them, and defining the criteria and the evidence they particularly need, gives you a tremendous chance for success. And then that profile will shift you to another path as things change. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I think that's really relevant because it's about preparedness. Most of my experience has been in therapeutics, so drugs and treatments, of which the regulation and the compliances are the most stringent compared to medtech, health tech, digital in health as a general rule. So normally you have to expect quite a bit of time to go through those compliances, to go through those regulatory demands, and that could be up to a year for therapeutics at least. Whereas you look at medical devices or medtech, health tech, they are reduced, but there are certain hoops you have to jump through, and that will demand time, expense, even certain entity setups in most situations as well. So just knowing not only what your own product is about, but understanding where you want to take it. And we'll come on to beachheads as well a bit later on, but actually thinking about where is it best to land first of all. So having that strategy, having that preparedness is absolutely key. Richard said about quite a few people look at doing what we refer to as the tourist route, where it's almost you visit a country, you might want to go and see Paris or Rome or whatever, rather than actually thinking before. It's more about what is the most relevant to an entry into Europe where we could grow the business from one territory rather than looking at Europe as a whole, which, we'll come on to the different territories as well. But I think that the overall thought there is just be ready. It's about having your strategy ready beforehand. And that's, I mean, to be honest, that's exactly the sort of thing that we do. We help companies to look at where they want to take the business and come up with a plan, which includes territory, but it's not, we're territory agnostic is the term that we use.
Yeah. So it sounds like the conversation naturally shifted from the capital conversation really to that sort of like execution, like how those companies can actually operate and scale in Europe. So you've touched really on sort of a bit. Maybe I want to go into a bit more detail really about the complexity about regulations potentially, but also there's that secondary option of like accessing customers, accessing channel partners. Like how do companies, if they're scaling and once they're there, like how do you feel that it changes to maybe the North American market from your understanding that like the engagement with customers and potentially finding those partners to help with that?
Well, if the question is about engaging with partners or establishing critical mass of penetration in your target
Yeah.
addressable market, I think that's the question,
Yeah.
if I understand correctly. Again, it comes back a little bit, like you coming back to knowing your archetype, but some businesses can kind of, I think always to achieve a certain scale to cover the sustainable cost of operating in Europe. So there's always going to be a question of how quickly can you achieve that sustainable revenue in order that you are successful. Now it comes down to your business model. So a lot of Canadian companies, particularly in that sort of pinnacle that we think are the highly attractive, they're typically going to need an established incumbent player in the market as the most efficient route in. So sometimes there could be a soft landing, there could be a distribution approach, there could be many flavors of softer, lower risk penetration strategies. But I think the kinds of people we meet here in these kinds of communities, it's actually you're going to need to leverage established players as part of the market strategy. Now there's no one size fits all, so probably oversimplifying it. But I think that's kind of the way to look at it is, combinations of in-region partnerships under terms that are appropriate for what you actually sell, whether it's within a supply chain or an OEM or distribution, could take on a number of flavors.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then you touched on it earlier. You were saying that Europe is like often seen as a single market, and some people it does look like a large single market. The more mature companies that have already explored that, they understand that it's not, and it doesn't operate in that way. But like in reality, have you seen sort of any common mistakes that companies might fall into as they look at Europe as a single go-to-market motion? Like, do you feel that that's something that is almost misunderstood regularly as companies look at Europe, or is there any sort of areas that you would advise, like easier access, whether you target this country first before expanding?
I'm really glad you asked that question. Because it really gets to the heart of it is, do I make a geographic-led decision? And actually, it also, I fear that when we talk about this too, it kind of creates almost an impenetrable bureaucratic barrier in front of Canadians. And I really hope that doesn't get communicated, because it's not like that. We've all lived here in Europe for 30 odd years. So we look at it slightly differently. As a business, we can works across about 106 IPAs in investment promotion agencies in Europe, or regional development agencies. So we actively look at not 20 or 30 markets, but actually 100 plus entities that exist for the purpose of bringing Canadians in effect, right? And they are not all created equal by any means.
So we're sort of going into some are cities, some are regions, some are...
Yeah. Well, so we're here in Geneva, so this is a perfect example, an absolutely wonderful sort of petri dish of what Europe's like, right? Because there's multiple countries, 26 cantons, effectively each one like a Canadian province, right?
It's true.
So imagine a geography the size of Switzerland with 7.5 million people, 26 cantons, each has its own tax base, raises its own tax, has its own discretion over inward investment. So, and you take that geography, you amplify it across all of Europe, you get all kinds of microsystems which have varying degrees of attractiveness to Canadians for varying reasons. That sounds daunting, but let me put a positive spin on that, right? Um, the, the reason why we see sort of the highly attractive, that is so significant from a reception perspective, from a pull perspective.
Mhm.
Um, some regions within Europe, for example, have very similar strategic targets for industries they want to bring into the region, and they are actively looking for certain ones. And the health tech will be definitely top of the list in many key markets. So that's a big pull. And we like to refer to the soft support mechanisms, right? Because it's hard to see this in a government brochure or on a data set, but there's soft support mechanisms. When you occupy a strategically attractive business sector, and that's reinforced by the fact that your particular business has got a strong balance sheet, a strong history, or has a strong potential,
Mhm.
um, they will bring resources to the table to handle the gentle sort of pre-approvals and get no notice of objections and open up some private conversations, and they will facilitate the softer mechanisms that actually really accelerate. Because the key risks once you start often come down to unexpected lag times to get documents approved, to get regulatory approvals on various pieces, and they stack up. And a mistake can suddenly turn to months, right? And you aggregate those, and suddenly you get a real risk. So the soft support is really powerful. It's there at Canadians' disposal when they understand how their particular business fits so beautifully with what. So it's interesting knowing a little bit about how that whole dynamic works is far more powerful than touring around to trade shows and hoping you have an opportunistic, good, fortunate moment. Rather say, I know very well that Fribourg Canton has a program that fits my business. There's money available, there's facilities available, there's resources that are going to help make phone calls and help me apply for things.
Mhm.
And that's a powerful beachhead.
And I think the solution is it's almost down to a bespoke solution per company, per product, per service. And it's worth going back to the thought about the 27 countries within Europe, because one example about regulation and compliance, the UK left the EU with Brexit. And so now there is a completely different process for it goes through the MHRA rather than the EMA. So it's not one size fits all. It's not one market. It's most definitely divided by country. And then within each country, there are different regions and cities that suit certain companies and services better than others. And you can't just say, well, it's medtech, so you go to this country or this region, or it's medical devices. It really is on a case by case basis. So that's again where you have to do your preparedness and look at what you want to achieve and actually set a strategy based on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like even from Costas's framing at the start, that 28th, that unified set of rules, it'll be interesting to see how that actually, if it
Definitely.
can actually work, if it can actually help from that perspective. Now, you mentioned it earlier, saying that like there's that attraction when you say like a company comes in with a strong balance sheet, but I wanted to touch on sort of the unseen, I guess that you could say the unseen expectations. So from my question here is, it's like, how do European expectations around traction or proof differ from the Canadian and North American investor typically look for, that which they might typically look for? And by that, I mean that a Canadian founder might think that an early pilot or a strong North American customer is enough to attract a European investor. But what are sort of those unseen intangibles that they actually look for that might differ if you're going over into Europe that they want? Is there anything outside of those proof of concepts?
That's a great. I think I could answer a little bit. I'll try to answer it sort of generic level.
Yeah.
And I think Philip, because so much of this is specific to the type of business you're in. I think, and you'll talk about how health tech is probably has its own nuances, right? Let me try to give it the generic answer. Again, bearing in mind you're at the growth stage, right? So growth stage means there should be evidence of a track record. There should be evidence of traction in the North American market, for example. That's in addition to that. there's more onus on KYC, AML, universal UBO beneficial owners, because just to get basic banking facilities. So the level of compliance requirements just to get basic business infrastructure, whether you're in healthcare or digital, whatever, anything that trades, is something you wouldn't experience in Canada or US. All of these things take time. They're not necessarily big things, but they layer up. You may take weeks to get a basic bank account. The capital providers, generally speaking here too, also want to have our stronger focus on retirement of risk, which means there's more focus on use of funds, which means there's more focus on use of funds tied to a determined conviction about why Europe. And that little bit undermines the value of your Canadian experience, because of course you want to demonstrate we have a great product that's showing traction in the Canadian market, whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a strong story in Europe, because it has to be very closely linked to why is Europe strategically important to your next step. So the capital providers will look for more evidence in that sense. So I guess to summarize, there'll be more regulatory work to kind of get the basic infrastructure in place, and then there'll be more information memorandum related type work to feed into your to your capital partners, and then you got to budget 9 to 12 months for just sort of regular due diligence. So all these things would maybe slightly different to what Canadians would have experienced if they've been in Canada, the US. Now that's a generic answer.
It's perfect timing. Yeah. I think just sort of to echo what Rich just said, it's less about looking just for the multiples and what it could actually return from an investment. Quite often, it's more about how can it benefit an ecosystem in one country, or some of the goals that might be for a certain region that align with that product and that service. There may be more funding available because of that, and more access to funding because of that, or more capital. So it's definitely it's not the same as the North American market. Even from a regulation point of view, you are looking at a more complex picture, but that doesn't mean that it's bad news. It just means that you need to choose carefully. And once you've chosen carefully, it makes it easier, and you've got a high rate of success.
Yeah, I keep it sounds negative. I just want to add to Phil's, because it feels like I don't mind this in a sense, because I think there's actually a very predictable process here. So in a way, it sounds like this is more onerous, this is more work, this is more effort, more cost, more time. It's not necessarily quite that simple, because I think actually it's very focused. It's very focused. It's determined. There's conviction, and actually that needs to be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounded like when you were saying like that infrastructure, they look at actually what the ecosystem benefits are. So I guess you could talk on that. At what point does a soft landing strategy actually become that real boots on the ground, that you've got that real presence in Europe? Is that something that if you have that in your strategy, like you understand there might be someone that's using partners there to scale there, or they actually want to bring a presence over there and have that real, as I said, not just a soft landing there on the ground? Is that something that you think European investors find particularly important?
In certain instances, absolutely. Those partnerships are really key. There might be partnerships with pharma companies, or with university hospitals, or a part of the supply chain. So it varies. I don't want to keep using that as a get out of jail answer, but it really is quite specific to each case. But the partnerships are key. There's been a couple of examples recently with Canadian companies coming over to Europe, and for instance, one purchased a company in France, so they had a beachhead in France first of all, and they grew from that purchased company. So that's one strategy, but there's quite a few strategies that we can adopt as well, and partly that's about partnerships. But so to answer your question, yes, you can attract capital by forming partnerships that actually are strategically beneficial to the outcome of the product, but also for the region and the area as well.
Now, I
So
know just so we're on time, because I want to leave some question time for the end, but I was
Yeah.
just going to say before we wrap up, the like just from each of you, maybe like what's the biggest red flag that tells you a company isn't ready yet to scale into Europe?
There's a few red flags. The biggest red flag.
You can each take one.
Um, I'll go first. I think if we get a sense that going to Europe is I'm shopping for cash for runway,
hmm
then that to me would suggest we step back and think about take another view of what we're doing. So I guess one red flag. I mean, that would be mine.
Okay.
I would say preparedness, if that's something scratch records, I've said that all the way through, but just having more of a strategic view as to where you're going to land. We didn't touch on beachheads too much, but thinking about where you are best to land first, even if you want to take on the whole of Europe, perhaps take a step back and think about which territory you want to go to first and then expand from there. So again, it's readiness and having a strategy.
hmm
Yeah, I think I will not add on top of it. It's already good.
Okay. And then, so final thoughts to the people listening, if they take away just one mindset shift or action that would materially improve their chances of successfully entering Europe, what should that be from you guys?
Well, we wanted to convey um, look at your business model first and determine why Europe would be the right choice.
Mhm.
Um, and define what the purpose is, and that purpose will then guide you the rest of the way. So as opposed to go shopping and hope that it reveals itself to you because that's too expensive. So I think that's the mindset shift.
I'll summarize. Know before you go.
Yeah.
He's the marketing and branding guy. He always has a better way of saying it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's something I'm hearing all the time. Like if you're looking at Europe just because of current geopolitical sort of tensions, then it might not be
Exactly
the
right.
right first. But if you actually think it's a viable market, and I mean, even just from Carney's speech that we had, we've seen this shift. It's not just short term that I think and you'll
Absolutely.
appreciate as former Canadians, that that yeah, I think it is something that is just it's not a short term solution. It's something you have to really be passionate about going. So I'll see if there's any questions in the need to find the chat.
don't have, yeah, not yet as we kind of queue up folks for it. I guess kind of part of it also too is as you guys are sort of speaking through this, and I know Costas unfortunately, geopolitical and other things, sort of happening around him, so he had to jump off. And also sort of sends his regards, and we'll also share some information around things that he touched upon with Horizon Europe and some of these notable sort of EU sort of landmark agreements that are starting to happen with Canada. Is kind of hearing what you're also saying is, that there's a bespokeness, there's a know before you go, but there's also you have to be agile and you have to sort of iterate as you go because this climate is changing so fast around us, sort of, economically and geopolitically. So as we wait for some folks to maybe put in their last questions, are you also seeing even more recently, rapidly, that shift in either mindset or approach or things that maybe you can lend some light on as folks are also taking those takeaways back?
Well, we have some anecdotal stories, which kind of goes, and I mean the net is everything Canadians are feeling. I suspect to come in and look at Europe and Asia and other markets. I mean, you can imagine there's a stronger and stronger reception in Europe to work with Canadians. So whatever you see there, believe me, the mirror is here too.
Yeah.
So how do you see that? I mean, we go through lots of anecdotal stories, just one. Working with the government of Estonia, which is interesting and really appropriate for smaller, earlier stage digital companies. They are a country of 1.3 million, but they've attracted 130,000 non-EU businesses to form a digital beachhead there. And they called us because it's increasingly Canadian. In fact, they're even looking at putting representation on the ground to help the whole what do you call it? bio passport basically process. So these kinds of stories come up with us every single day, which is great. And I think it kind of gives us a sense of urgency that we really need to get busy.
Do you see, I mean, Estonia, like mentioned Estonia there, is it they're attracting the earlier stage scale ups? Are they doing that through sort of tax incentives, or is it how are they attracting sort of that stage?
Well, there's a very clever activity going on about how to attract, right? First of all countries tend to want to attract. And there's a couple of things to keep in mind, not for the same, they're not attracting business for the same purpose. Um, we were a little bit surprised to learn that some geographies in Europe are not particularly interested in companies that generate employment. And we always thought that was a key driver. They have very, very high employment. They're actually want to look at companies that are in very key strategic markets, quite often in defense and so on, things like that. So it's very strategically determined. Tax incentives generally not as much because there's some strong constraints around tax incentive latitude. But again, coming to the soft support idea, local regional governments are very good at putting in just subsidized business services, free accounting services, early fast track registration. They do a lot of things that make it easier, and they compete based on these.
Yeah, I was about to say Estonia, we would use that as one example, but there are obviously other countries within Europe, and that they all have their own incentives, easy entry, more preferred alignment to their own objectives. So it really, again, varies. It does vary.
Yeah. To answer your question, Estonia, it's English language and tremendous speed. So they're going after fast moving digital, get them on the ground, get them trading. If you're a health tech, that's not your route to Europe. Your route to Europe is going to be through the clinical trial approval. Yes, it's different. So therefore, there's a different geography where they're more tuned to help you with that.
Yeah.
No, that's super helpful. And I know we've got a couple of questions, so we will be sharing some links post webinar, for example, around sort of Horizon, because as Costas was mentioning, the Canada Roadshow is going to be happening, and just some of those opportunities are there because that also opens up a unique opportunity for sort of our innovators and some of our post secondary and other partners that are on this call to just explore what those modalities can be. A couple of things, sort of in terms of next steps, sort of moving forward. So we'll be able to sort of share contact details for those that are sort of interested in getting to know more about WeCan and all of that. We can also share out those details as well. And I think also just before we close, just one kind of thing that you touched upon, and then Chris will kind of have you the final word before we close out, is you spoke around sort of things, for example, like the cluster program and digital sort of, that access that non-dilutive capital sort of provides, injections into these, projects, which are then sort of fueling this SME growth. And something you touched upon that's looked upon sort of very favorably. So for those that are part of these, engagements sort of with digital, for example, that's something to really sort of showcase and flag that this would be seen sort of as a net positive on the investment side. And do you have any sort of final guidance around that before I hand it to Chris?
Yeah. Shall I go?
You go for it. Yeah.
I think absolutely it's seen as positive. It's seen as de-risking as far as a European investor. We're talking about that particular source of capital. It's been de-risked. It's already received match funding in Canada. So there's an element of proof of concept, commercialization. So it definitely is seen as a positive.
They have similar programs here too, so they're very familiar. A lot of the people you're going to be engaging with, they recognize the construct. Yeah, you almost come pre-certified in many respects.
Yeah.
The caution though is, look, you've been through that process, so you're not looking to enter it again. You're now moving beyond the non-dilutive subsidy. You're looking for different partnerships. So,
yeah.
But the nice thing is they're familiar with where you've come from.
Okay, Chris, final word before we close out.
Well, I think Richard, you touched on it perfectly. I think Canadian organized, like a lot of the Canadian organizations, like we've got fantastic tech. We've gone through that. We just need to scale. We need these large anchor firms here, and that opportunity is obviously to turn into a multinational. So Europe is a market and potential for them to scale when maybe not the North American market isn't looking so favorable right now. I think that there is a real opportunity there for people in the room as they sort of look at diversifying their customer base if they haven't already done so. I don't want to make that assumption, but it is obviously something, and that yeah, we'll share your contact details and to engage with you all in the future. And yeah, it's been a great conversation. I hope to have many more.
Thank you
Thanks,
all for
Chris.
carving out time, gentlemen. I know it's late in the evening your time, and for those of us joining in Europe, to Costas who joined us, we will be once again sharing a copy of the recording as well as some of the foundational resources over the coming week or so for those of you that are with us today. That's it from all of us at Digital. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar session. Thanks, and have a great day.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.